thank you all for coming, for one thing. I really appreciate having an audience. You never know when you're going to have 2 people or 40 people. First of all, I need to say that I lied. This is longer than 30 minutes.
Goodbye.
Sorry about that. But I also would like to thank some people who really have made this possible. First is a person some of you knew, but many of you would not, and that is Ruth Hunky-Bauer. Ruth was the secretary of the church office here for over 50 years, through 5 senior pastors. She was the one that, I can't talk much louder than that. She was the one that was really in charge of the church, I think. She was still secretary when I became a senior pastor in 1982. Anyway, Ruth is the one who saved everything. Bits of paper, scraps of this and that, which we discovered in the 80s and 90s in about every cabinet and closet and big niche around this church. In every corner there was something. And today has become the archives, which now fill almost 3 rooms upstairs on the top floor. So all these pictures and all are partly because of what she saved. The other person is Barb Arsenault, and who worked with Colleen Henry, my wife, to form the archives, and she is really the organizer of them still today and knows where everything is. Another is Sue Finkel. Sue has worked tirelessly digitizing how many photographs and slides?
Well, several thousand slides so far.
Several thousand slides so far. A major job. And then Jeff Carlson, who, first of all, asked me to do this and has made it possible because I don't understand how to do any of this equipment. So that doesn't count in my 30 minutes. Here we go. St. Paul's story is really a story of crisis, of surviving, and more than surviving, thriving. In 1843, the church was founded by 9 immigrant families, or as the old records say, 9 men and also their wives. My guess is it probably was even more also their wives that did it. A man had died in this small group of German immigrants in Chicago, and they had no pastor or church to do the funeral. So they decided they needed to form a church, which they did in 1843. It was one of the first 5 or 6 churches in the town of Chicago when it was formed. And I asked in the promo for this day, I asked what else was the major thing that happened in the city in 1843. Who knows what that is? Well, the city council passed a law requiring that people not let their pigs run in the streets. That was the major event according to the earlier story. They worshipped as a new church on Reformation Sunday, the last Sunday in October in 1843. And so last October was our 175th anniversary of a worship service. However, it was not until the spring of 1844 that they built this building. And the church, the congregation in German was called Gemeinde. The church building was called Kirche. And so that's why this slide is the Kirche. It was a log cabin, and it was the first church north of the Chicago River. And according to the stories and the legends, people carried the logs from a sawmill south of the river north into what today we would know as River North neighborhood. And so this building was built at the southwest corner of LaSalle and Ohio streets. There are records left of what that first building was like inside. One thing for sure we know is that the pews were this, 9-inch benches. So imagine sitting for a 2-hour service on a 9-inch bench, dressed as they were then with men in wool and women in big dresses. Can you imagine that? I think you earned your way into heaven by just sitting. Today, this is the building that stands on that site. It's an office building. It was also the site of a sports bar at one time. They called their first pastor in 1846. So even though they were formed in 1843, had a building in 1844, it was really not until 1846 that they had a pastor. They called Augustus Cella, who was a German Lutheran, and they found out later he was a very strict German Lutheran and not of their own heritage. Their heritage of this congregation was Prussian. And in Prussia, the church had already been through a merger, and it was a merger of both Lutheran bodies and what we would know as Reformed or Presbyterian bodies. And so it was a little more inclusive than a strict German. Cella was, however, not at all inclusive, and he was trying to get the congregation to come to him with private confession before they could have communion and other such things, and they said, no way. And so they parted ways in 1848 when Cella left to form a new denomination, which is called the Missouri Synod Lutheran Church, which is still in existence. And there is a First St. Paul's Evangelical Lutheran Church in Carl Sandburg Village area on LaSalle Street in Garrett. And that church and this church until 1848 were one church. When he left, and in his autobiography, he called our church ancestors an unruly mob of religious hybrids. And we still are today. Thank God. This is a copy of the Constitution of that very first church. It was written in 1846, and we still have that. And amazingly so, after all these years, it's in this book. I got it upside down. It's in this book, along with many other records handwritten in German script. And this book has, well, it wasn't bound at one time, but it has survived all these years. And it's given us a pretty good idea of what was going on in the city and in the church back in those years. The name of the church was the Deutsche Evangelische Lutherische St. Paulus Gemeinde von Chicago. The German Evangelical Lutheran Church, or Lutheran Congregation of Chicago in 1846. When Cella left, they changed the name, they added Vereinigt to it. In German, Vereinigt means united. And so it became the Deutsche Vereinigt Evangelische Lutherische St. Paulus Gemeinde. Kind of a foreshadowing of the United Church of Christ itself in a way. And it brought together a variety of people and their backgrounds, tracing way back to not only Luther, but to Calvin and to Zwingli as well in the Reformation. Following Cella was Pastor Fisher. Pastor Fisher didn't stay very long either. And it's pretty unclear why he didn't stay. Some say that, some records say that he did not like the Chicago winters, or perhaps that we never had spring, I don't know. And then Joseph Hartman came. Joseph Hartman came in 1851. He stayed till 1886. He is the first pastor emeritus of this congregation, retiring in 1886. During Hartman's time, a lot happened. The congregation really grew. A lot of German immigrants were coming to this country and to this city. He assisted in founding a new denomination, which was the Evangelical Synod of the Northwest. He also helped found a college, which we know today is Elmhurst College. Because of the growth of the congregation, they needed to build a larger church, which they did on the site of that log cabin. And so they built this church and they dedicated it in 1855. And the interesting thing, I think, is that this cup that you use in communion every month is from 1855. Wow. And it was given by the confirmation class in celebration of the new church building. And so our ancestors back in the 1800s actually drank from this cup. a lot to think about. It's really kind of interesting to me. And I guard it with my life. There is, since then, the tray that the bread sits on is from 1857, confirmation class, and the candlestick is from confirmation class of 2001. So all of the items that we use in communion each month are from confirmation class. It was kind of a really golden age for St. Paul's, and Hartman is said to have baptized 13,055 babies. That's a lot of babies to baptize. And people have asked, were there that many members of the congregation? There were not. What happened back then is if you were German and you were a Protestant, you probably connected to St. Paul's and you had your child baptized by the pastor. A new challenge, the Civil War, brought major change for the congregation as young men went off to fight in the war. Brought a challenge and a lot of confrontation as well. St. Paul's was one of the four sponsors of what was called the Colored People's Convention. In that time, soon after the war began, or right before the war began. And those were made up primarily of runaway slaves who decided not to hide anymore. So they got cut out and ready to protest. And so there were some organizations, including St. Paul's, that supported them. In fact, Abraham Lincoln said because of that movement and others in Boston, it's likely the cause of the Civil War. Whether he meant that as a compliment or as a derogatory way, I don't know. St. Paul's was very concerned, however, what would happen with children who were orphaned by the war, whose parents were killed, or whose fathers were killed. And so they began in a woman's home. Her name was Christine Rosville. It began an orphanage, and then it became known as a half orphanage as well. And that was the home was located on LaSalle Street as well. Sports Authority, I think, was there the last building there. It's gone too, I think. But that's where her home was. It soon outgrew her home, and they built this building, which was on Armitage Street, and right about where the Lincoln Park High School's parking lot is today, was this building. It was called the German Orphans Asylum at the time. But it also served what were then called half orphans. And half orphans were those children whose dads had been killed, but whose mothers could not afford to keep them. And so they either became residents of this home, or they became like what we would today call a daycare. They were taken care of during the day while their mothers went to work. And at that time, they were called half orphans. Then along came this lovely gentleman and his lovely wife, Carl and Johanna Ulick, and they gave a sizable donation to this German orphans home, and it was renamed Ulick Children's Home in 1869. And so their gift to the home was really what is today the South Loop. It was farmland back then. And so the farmland was farmed and it became a light industrial area, and the proceeds were given to the home. But then later the home sold it and became part of the endowment for Ulick Children's Home. This is another site of the home, which is on Mozart Street. Its most recent home before it moved to North Lawndale. Today this is a Jewish school. It was there for many years from the early 1920s until recently when it moved to North Lawndale. And we need to get a photograph of the North Lawndale home and put in there. It greatly expanded from just being a residential home for orphans into serving abused and neglected children, victims of violence in the city, through counseling, through independent living, through education, and other programs, which it has today. It also became known as Ulick Children's Advantage Network, or UCAN, which is what we know it as today, as UCAN. another crisis, the Great Chicago Fire. Not only had things kind of settled down after the Civil War, but along came the fire, which burned the city. This is the day after the fire, a photograph taken. Again, those records survived. Isn't that amazing? There's handwritten records from 1940 survived this fire, along with this cup. Survived that fire. Not much else, but those things did. They built a third building, a third church on that site, and dedicated it 2 years later in 1873. It looks a lot like the second church. They didn't have a lot of imagination, but they had a lot of determination. So they built that church on the very same site. An interesting story related to that building is that it was built without a mortgage. And the way that happened was the story is told that the members of the congregation sold their land where their houses were before they burned on the near north side of Chicago, sold their land to developers who were now moving into the north side of Chicago, north of the river, for a lot more money than they were able to buy yet new land for their homes here in the cheap neighborhood of Lincoln Park. At the death of Hartman, they called a pastor by the name of Rudolph John. This new pastor was fluent in both German and English, and he was called to begin to move the church away from being exclusively a German ethnic church to a German-American church. This is his first elected church council in 1890. He is the one in Rudolph John. A younger picture of this is the guy in mutton chops sitting at the desk. This is the church council, all gentlemen, of course, of 1890. What he also began was a newsletter called the Bulletin, which was English and in German. He began what probably was one of the first English as second language classes in the church, teaching German-speaking people how to speak English. And he founded was called then the Jugendverein, for the young people's group. And it was the Jugendverein that began to lobby for the first English service. Here's the choir of 1893. I've been trying to get Kurt to get a picture of the choir today, seated like this. This is the choir of 1893. You see, women were allowed into the choir, just not in the council. So they began an English service, but not until 1909, when they began it as once a month. And it met with controversy, amazingly so. Like, even though they had brought John in as the pastor to move the church forward into becoming German-American, there were some people on the church council particularly who pointed to the old Constitution where it said, "The language of this congregation shall be German for all time." And they did not want to change. But it had such an overwhelming success that it became a monthly service. The English service did, later in 1909, and then later became a weekly service along with the German service. And we were able here, amazingly so, to keep the German service going until 2001, when the pastor who preached that, the pastor who preached that service wanted to retire, and the congregation had dwindled to about a handful of people. We kept it going all those years. In 1893, which was the 50th anniversary of the congregation, a woman by the name of Catherine Nolfi gave 3 bells to the church, and they hung in the tower of that old church building, and they were later moved from that building to the building that was built here in 1898. And this is the picture, approximately 1898 or somewhere around 1900, of what Lincoln and Halstead and Fullerton looked like. The streets were still mud, and there were streetcars running in them. So it was not a well-developed neighborhood at the time, but it was beginning to develop. And they built this church. This was the 1898 church building, built at the corner of Kemper and Orchard Streets. Why it wasn't built at the corner of Fullerton and Orchard is kind of a mystery, although I gather that the land at this part of the building sits on was not available at the time. But people have asked that question, why was it built, what today would be kind of not the center of things. If you look carefully at this photograph, the little two-story building off to the side, to the right of the picture, or to your left of your picture, is today still standing, really. It was incorporated into this building. It did not burn, and it is today the senior pastor's office on the one level, and the confirmation rooms on the top level today. It was just remodeled after the fire, but it has water, it has smoke smell in it sometimes. When it rains, I could still smell smoke if I went close to the windows. The smoke smell still there.
Tom, do you think it was that red?
Pardon?
You think it was that red?
It was pretty red, I think. But, I mean, for those who know.
So is that facing Orchard?
This is facing Orchard, yes. Right. So Kepler would be off this way, and Orchard is the street you see in front. Right. So there's 3 bells removed to this site, to the 4th building, and it was about the same time that this building was built that people began to discover those things called germs. And so that common cup communion, this cup, was replaced. I mean, they kept it, but they replaced it with these little silver communion cups. There were literally hundreds of these at one time. Do you remember that?
I don't even remember those.
Okay. I mean, I don't know when they stopped using them, surely, but there were literally hundreds. But most of them actually, at the 1955 fire, most of them melted into a large ball of silver. And a few have survived. This is one of the very few that have survived. But can you imagine? The reason for the move to this church building from where they were on LaSalle and Ohio streets is given officially as it was now far from where the families lived. They lived here. They would go to worship further south. If you dig deeper into the records, you find out that one of the reasons for the move, at least, was that the old neighborhood had become unsavory with the addition of an influx of the Italians and the Irish. Some things never change. The mural in the social hall is one of the very few things that we didn't even know survived until a woman in the congregation whose great uncle was the artist of that recovered it from a storeroom and had it restretched and gave it to us. It's certainly not my favorite piece of art, but it is from the old church building. It was one of the murals in the entrance hall. There were several murals in that church building. This is the photograph of that church interior. Down below is what Jeff talked about, which is the altar with Jesus over the altar, murals on each side. Above the altar was the choir and the organ. And so the choir faced the congregation, the organist sat in the center. And off here to this side, you see a little balcony? That was the pulpit. So it was reached by a spiral staircase up into the pulpit. Those were the grand old days when, pastors were respected. That would feel kind of strange to me. But anyway, that's the way it was. And this is the interior of that church building.
Tom, was that spiral staircase the one that went over to?
Yes. Actually, for many years it was located. It had been taken and located in John Barley Corner. If you remember, the spiral staircase was over there. That was from here.
Is it still there?
It probably still is there, but
Should get it back.
the restaurant is closed, so I'm not sure anymore what's there anymore. But it was there, even after they remodeled it, they moved it, but it was still there.
They moved it.
The same year that they they built this and dedicated this church building, they also bought this house as the parsonage for the congregation at 614 Fullerton. They purchased this house in 1898 for $17,500. They sold it in 1955 for $18,500.
Oh, my God.
And the last sale was just under $3 million. Some decisions are not great decisions.
Hindsight.
Another crisis, World War I, greatly affected German Americans. Young men from this congregation possibly went into war against family members from Germany. It was a tough time. There was a great distrust of German Americans. One story is told of the Chicago Symphony. Many members of the symphony at the time were German, but there were also some French members. It's told that when they played a German piece, the French members of the orchestra would play flat. Little petty things like that. But this church had to receive a dispensation from the government in order to continue its German services, the German language. It really was the first use of the name German American as well, as a hyphenated name. And the name of the church was changed. From the German that I gave you earlier, and I will not repeat again, from that German to First St. Paul's Evangelical Lutheran Church of Chicago. But because they wanted to hang on, even they were forced to change their name, they wanted to hang on to a little bit of heritage, and so surreptitiously they did not put an apostrophe in Paul's. And that's why there is no apostrophe in St. Paul's. They held on to a little bit of their heritage, but in German, there is no apostrophe. A new associate pastor came in 1911 to serve along with Rudolph John. His name was Jacob Pister. A funny story of many years later, when I came in 1974, I was the youth pastor. And I was young at one time, believe it or not. I was the youth pastor, and I had an overnight stay here at the church with the youth group, the high school youth group. And at one time, these portraits of the pastors were in the hallway upstairs. And I noticed the next morning that two of the pastors' photographs were missing, paintings were missing. And when I came around the corner, I saw that over the men's room door was Rudolph John's photograph. And inside over the urinal was Pastor Pister. And I was sure I was going to be fired. Rudolph John and Jacob Pister served together until 1926, when Rudolph John retired from here and became the first executive director and chaplain of a newly formed institution, St. Paul's House. St. Paul's House began opened in 1921, the first of its kind in this area. It was a home for the elderly, and still is a home for the elderly. The difference was that at the time, if you couldn't stay with your family as you got older, or in your own home, you were sent off to what was called a county home. And the county homes were pretty much like warehouses with beds. It was a pretty bad situation. And seeing that, this congregation decided that their elderly deserved something more, and they built St. Paul's House. This is the entrance, and it's still like that today. And it still looks like this today as well, on Mozart Street. It pretty much was like what we would today call independent living. Small, very small apartments. People lived with smaller apartments then than they do now. And it's not until 1974 that a convalescent home was added to it, adding assisted living and skilled care. And today it's called St. Paul's House. It's still today. It was bought by the Lutheran Church Services several years ago, and I understand it is up for sale again. it got to the point it couldn't stand alone as a home for the elderly. It needed a broader network to survive. Another crisis, the Depression. The Depression of 1929. It hit St. Paul's particularly bad. A lot of the money that had been put together into an endowment in 1922 was used up. The bank accounts got very low. Many Germans who had come here to escape the Depression in Germany in those years ran right into it again here in the United States. They had to start over. St. Paul's was a sponsor of many of those people, and this is showing a bread line, as a matter of fact. On the walls back there, you can see some photographs, one of which is Oscar Mayer giving free meat to people who were unemployed in 1929. I understand he also gave dimes to children who would come through every Saturday morning. But he knew, the story is told, he knew if a kid had come through and tried to come through twice, he would say, no, you haven't done it already. I'll tell you more about Oscar Mayer later. At this time, in 1934, in 1929 actually, he came as an associate pastor and became a senior pastor in 1934 with George Scherger. George Scherger was quite an intelligent man and quite an educated man. He had a doctorate in history, and he taught at the Armour Institute, which is today IIT. He taught there as well as being the senior pastor here. Because of his convictions, he brought a great deal of controversy to St. Paul's Church. He, along with other German intellectuals in this country at the time and academics, he was strongly supportive of Adolf Hitler. He thought Hitler was going to rebuild the glory days of Germany before World War I. And so he preached sermons in support of what was going on over there. He was recognized actually by the Red Cross, the German Red Cross, for his service to the homeland, and because of his support. This is the page from our church newsletter, as a matter of fact, showing that certificate. But however, when he proposed that the flag of the Third Reich be put into the church sanctuary along with the American flag and the Christian flag, the church council voted him down. And they removed all symbols of nationalism from our sanctuary. And today, we still follow that practice. Many churches have an American flag and what's called the Christian flag. We do not, because of that. It was a pretty amazing move on their part, because back then, the Herr Pastor was the Herr Pastor, and you likely did not cross him, but they did, and they removed all the flags. It's interesting that along with that, to give both sides of this, along with his support of Hitler, he was also writing articles in support of the German Jews. He just had not, like many others, had not made that connection. And we think, how can that be? But then look at today. Look at what happens. When Hitler invaded Poland and Austria, however, his writings in support of Hitler stopped abruptly. And Scherger actually had a mental breakdown and a physical breakdown and died in 1949. And a new pastor came, Gerhard Brauer. Brauer entered into the ministry here right before the start of World War II, another tense time. And we do know for sure at this time that the cousins were fighting against cousins. There were FBI agents who came to church on Sunday morning to make sure that nothing subversive was being preached at St. Paul's Church. Brauer's daughter Joanne told me that she, as a child, called them men in hats. And the men in hats would come and visit the parsonage every Sunday afternoon and take her father aside to talk with him, to make sure again that nothing subversive was being done. And yet, soon after the war, it was a great time of growth. And this building, this part of the building includes the gym and the chapel and the parlor, and this room and the kitchen were built in 1951. And after more than 20 years of discussion, as Shirley has told me before, it seemed like every year they were going to build it and then they didn't, but they finally did in 1951. It was kind of a golden age for St. Paul's. And there were some significant families that built this part of the building. One is the Oscar Mayer family, and this room is named for Oscar Mayer. And there are several photographs of his family and his work on the wall behind you. Another is...
And my sister's in it.
Yes, Shirley's sister. In the far left picture is a little girl, and that's Shirley's sister.
It's my sister.
Also, the Mr. and Mrs. Wiebolt are in that photograph. They're the other family, and the gym is named for the Wiebolts, although it's never called Wiebolt Gym, but it's named for them. Bueller, the chapel, is named for Bueller. The first Bueller was actually one of the inventors of the first adding machines. Later became a computer company. And Kreutchen, whose name is in the parlor. They're all gone, but they left us a very expensive legacy here in these buildings. No sooner had all this happened, however, than in 1955, well, first of all, I'm going to show you the church. The last photograph that we know of the church sanctuary was Christmas Day, 1955. And this is from down below. You saw it before up above. This is down below. Note the Christmas trees on either side of the altar. That is the last photograph we know of, because that night, Christmas night, 1955, the sanctuary caught fire. They believe it was an electrical fire from work being done on the organ. Burned the church to the ground the next day. See, there is an NBC News film of what happened, and I'm not using it today, but it shows the tower toppling down while the bells are ringing. It's quite an eerie sight. And seeing what happened with Notre Dame recently brought that back to me again, and seeing the spire. The tower here fell on top of the gymnasium, the interior of that church. This is the tower that was above it. And this is the one bell that survived. It's sitting in the courtyard yet today. At one time you could actually see what was inscribed on it: Glaube, Hoffnung und Liebe, faith, hope, and love. That's kind of been weathered away. And we discovered inside it actually says making a joyful noise. So when we took the motto in 1982 of making a joyful sound in the city, we didn't know that inside that bell were those words actually in German. Until 1991, when it was raised up off the ground and put on a pedestal.
Tom, could you go back to the previous slide for just a second? Could you go back to the previous slide for just a second?
That one?
Looking at the red zone there.
Oh.
And also, it actually looks a little bit like limestone, but it's granite, I assume. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. A new church was built, dedicated, cornerstone laid in 1957, dedicated in 1959, and this is the church you know as St. Paul's today. The same year as that church was cornerstone was raised, St. Paul's became part of a new denomination, the United Church of Christ, in 1957, bringing together the Evangelical Reformed churches, which were the German background churches, and the Congregational Christian churches, which were more from the Reformation in England. And so we really do owe our roots back to all the reformers of the 16th century. Frederick Choate came in that time. He came in 1962 and later became the senior pastor. He was my predecessor, my boss. At the time he came was a great time of change. He actually was the last fluent German speaker here as a preacher, as a pastor. It was a time of change. The civil rights movement brought major changes to this country in terms of laws that needed to be changed. Because upheaval here in Chicago, especially after King was assassinated in 1968, parts of the west side and the south side neighborhoods went up in flames. Also, the Vietnam War divided congregations all over this country. And St. Paul as well, although it didn't affect us as difficultly as it did some congregations. But there were some who found it, to be totally against the law to support any protest. So it was a kind of great change as well with that. The Democratic National Convention in 1968 brought major protests to the city. There were tanks on Lakeshore Drive. I was just new to the city. A small town kid comes to the city. And I was in seminary in Hyde Park, but I had a pastoral internship at Wellington Avenue Church, which is located in Lakeview, that way. And so on Sunday mornings, I would come up Lakeshore Drive from the seminary to my job at Wellington Avenue and pass these vehicles and these National Guardsmen who also were in the parks. It was over here in Lincoln Park. There were college and high school kids as well who came and were camping out in the park over here. And the National Guardsmen were told, and the police were told by the city to gas them, tear gas. These kids were scared to death. And so St. Paul's brought them in and packed them into the gym and kept them here until their parents could come and get them or they could find a way home. This did lead to controversy in the congregation. There were those who felt that the church was breaking the law. It had been supported by the pastors and by the council and some other members, but not by some of them. So it was a difficult time, and the church here and as well other places lost members. In 1974, nearing the end of all of that, I came as an associate pastor, again as a youth pastor. In the nursery here, there were 2 children when I came. One was my daughter, who was 9 months old, and Georgia Smith took care of her. And Ilsa Weeby, 2 women that Ilsa you don't know, but Georgia we do. And so it was very small. Now you look at the nursery and now look at the church school and what a difference. Many churches closed in those years. Over here at Belden and on Geneva, this was the Lutheran Church. Grace Lutheran Church is now a condo. This Reformed Church on Webster is now a private home. This apartment building sits where a huge Baptist church once sat. And on its sign outside it once had "In Business for God." But it went out of business because of neglect, obviously. So that one changed. This site here, right across from Lincoln Park High School, was St. Mary's Presbyterian Church. It was torn down and it merged with Lincoln Park Presbyterian Church. We held on. There are people who are here today who I consider among the pioneers of that time who helped us hang on. One sitting way back there, there's others sitting up here, and who kept this church open. USA Memorial Endowment Fund principle that had been built up from 1922 was used. The church was kept open. There was a staff kept here. And so, I congratulate many of you who were here at that time and helped to make this happen. In 1981, Fred Trost left to become the Wisconsin minister, and after a search process, I was asked to become the 9th senior pastor in 1982. And a team of pastors, associate pastors since then, were Glenn Loafman, Carol Monroe, Randy Deckworth, Avina Ward, Jeff Carlson, and now Those were while I was here, and now Sarah Garcia.
And I was on your search committee.
That's right.
She's responsible.
Yeah.
So you can blame her.
Yeah.
We've made changes to this building during the time that I was here. This is the ramp outside that was installed, and we at least partially made the building more accessible with washrooms changing and the addition of the lift and the ramp. And if you look carefully at this and know what it looks like, you realize this slides in backwards. The ramp's going in the wrong direction. We greatly expanded the building as a benevolence and made many changes. The congregation has grown considerably. When I came in 1974, there were sometimes 80 people on Sunday morning. We weren't sure it would survive, but it did. It has survived, and more than survived, it has thrived. And many of you are to be commended for that. You helped it do it. We've done things since then. We've become part of the Pride Parade each year through the Chicago Coalition of Welcoming Churches. St. Paul actually became open and affirming. In 1989, we were number 40 in the United Church of Christ to do that. Today there are, you know, Jeff, more than 1,300, but I don't know the number. There are more than 1,300 today. We were number 40, which is pretty amazing back then. We founded the Lincoln Park, along with other churches, the Lincoln Park Community Shelter, which is now Lincoln Park Community Services, and which is at one time, when it first started, this is where the home was slept. This is where they ate their meals. Our kitchen was used. They were able to take showers in our locker rooms. One locker room was converted to a laundry facility, so that was used. Those are still used today in the community engagement program on Sunday. They later made the move to Lincoln Park Presbyterian as a permanent site, or semi-permanent at least, and now to a permanent site. They will be moving in another month. Mission trips everywhere, Appalachia to a Native American reservation, youth mission trips were begun, and every year supported by the church as they took off. Again, we now have, oops.
You know that.
I'll tell you more about mission trips later. In 2010, I retired after 36 years here, and other things have begun. The rummage sale was begun here. Pastor Matt Fitzgerald was called as the 10th senior pastor, and he has now been here 7 years. Yeah, 7, I think. Just many things have continued to move on. The church moves on. The Stephen Ministry was begun, which is a lay ministry, and every Sunday after worship, someone comes to the front to meet with those who would like to come forward for prayer. The Oktoberfest was revived and moved to the street out in front, which we were able to do because the hospital was no longer there with its quiet zone. Other community engagement programs, the Easter Bunny, Santa Claus, and others. Polar Peace March was started in support of UCAN and its work against violence in the city, and that has been very successful, raising more than, what, 50,000, I think, last year. Again, mission trips continued to Haiti. And again, we have a group in Haiti right now who has just left to go there, working on a school and medical facilities, and more. And Ian, as I said, in 1982, we took the motto, making a joyful sound in the city, and I think we've taken that very seriously and continue to take it seriously. As this church moves on into this century and hopefully beyond. And I thank you all.